On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., a catastrophe occurred that would forever change the lives of the people of Ukraine and the surrounding countries. 3 kilometers from the town of Pripyat stood a marvel in technology at the time, a massive nuclear power plant that employed several thousand people. On that fateful morning, the 176 employees of Block 4 were to conduct a test on the self-fueling system of the reactor, something that could save energy. Within Block 4, there were 3 main operators involved in the test: the senior control engineer, the shift foreman, and their superior for the night, Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. Interviews with those in the control room that night informed that the test was being operated under unsafe conditions as per Dyatlov's request. The reactor was never supposed to drop below 700 megawatts, but the chief engineer wanted to save as much cooling water as possible despite the dangers involved. He instructed that the power be dropped to only 200 megawatts. Reactor 4, however, which was the newest commissioned reactor, had a flaw in it that the engineers were unaware of that made it highly unstable when run at low power. Dropping the power as requested, the control engineer accidentally dropped it too fast, and at 12:40 a.m. the reactor stalled out. In order to raise the power back up, the engineers would have to pull uranium-fueled rods from the cooling waters in order to generate it. Both senior engineers in the control room knew that this would make the reactor much more unstable, but Dyatlov insisted that it be done. The risky tactic succeeded in getting the power back up to 200 megawatts, but at 12:52 a.m. there was another alarm that indicated a water shortage, and the longer these alarms kept going off, the more pressure was building up in the bottom of the ever-unstable reactor number 4. The test was designed to turn off the water turbine, letting it coast until diesel generators kicked on to continue powering it. There was a 40-second delay, however, and without enough cooling water, the reactor would become a dry time bomb. The engineers were unaware of the building hotspot in the bottom of the reactor, so at 1:23 a.m. the power to this turbine was shut off. The water slowed and the steam continued to build in the already pressured reactor. Noticing a power surge, the engineers lowered the rods back into the reactors to slow this effect. However, were unaware that doing so initially raised the power before lowering it due to graphite on the tips. The power skyrocketed in seconds, turning Reactor 4 into a pressure cooker that exploded in a disaster 10 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The blast tore the lid off of the reactor and destroyed the building that it was held in, spreading a powerful stream of radioactive vapor, graphite, and uranium hundreds of meters around the plant. From the devastation, a fountain of radioactive fire shot 1,000 meters into the air, described by citizens of Pripyat as bright, colorful, even beautiful. The reactor was destroyed, but the horrors had only just begun. Firemen were alerted to the scene, dumping tons of water on the fire to no avail. Without knowing it, they were all exposed to lethal doses of radiation and no gear to combat it. 2 men died that night, with 28 to follow in the coming months. These were the first victims of Chernobyl, but they were far from the only ones. The first reporter on the scene, Igor Kostin, flew in by helicopter, also unaware of the radioactive dangers. He snapped shots of the destroyed reactor with dark and grainy photos that were a result of the exposure. Due to faulty information circulating the government about no explosion and only fire, the citizens of Pripyat were allowed to continue on life as usual, told that everything was fine with the reactor, a mistake they'd soon come to realize. With mass soldiers in the streets and mysterious deaths in the night, there was still no official reason to panic. However, unknown to them, within the first days after the explosion, these citizens received over 50 times what was considered a safe dose of radiation. It wasn't until 30 hours after the explosion that the first security measures were enforced. More than 1,000 buses arrived to evacuate the city, forcing citizens to leave everything behind, and told that it would only be for 3 days, but in reality, they would never return. No one could get near the reactor without being contaminated with deadly doses of radiation within 15 minutes. for at the bottom of the destroyed chamber, 1,200 tons of magma still continued to burn at 300,000 degrees, spreading radiated particles into the wind. If nothing was done, nearby countries and beyond would become contaminated with the direction of the wind. Air support was sent in to dump sandbags onto the fire in the depths of the reactor, resulting in pilots getting sick after only a few trips to the site. The next step in securing the destruction involved draining the water from beneath the reactor to prevent another explosion if the magma reached it, pouring lead on top of the furnace, building a cooling system beneath the structure to cool the magma, and ultimately sealing the whole reactor area in a sarcophagus. The first two tasks exposed firemen, military, and civilian volunteers alike to the harmful levels of radiation. Among them, 600 pilots were fatally contaminated, and all of them died. The cooling system was to be constructed with the aid of 10,000 Russian miners. They worked without protection from the radiation, breathing in the contaminated dirt, removing masks and shirts due to the heat, and drinking contaminated water that would kill many of them. They were all exposed and never informed of the dangers. At the completion of their jobs, the room was built, but the cooling system was never installed, but instead filled with cement to solidify the structure. The final task of cleaning up the destruction and building a sarcophagus would require a mass amount of manpower. The project was labeled the liquidation of the Chernobyl accident, and recruited 100,000 troops as well as 400,000 civilians from every Chernobyl republic passing through Chernobyl to aid the cause. Duties of the army would include spraying the air with a substance that absorbed radiation, hunting and killing contaminated animals, evacuating and knocking down buildings contaminated with radioactive dust, and ultimately assist in building the sarcophagus of steel and concrete. Cleaning up the blown-out reactor was the most dangerous job, as humans were only able to work that close to the destruction for a few moments at a time. Originally, they battled this problem with the construction of robots that would go up onto the roof of the reactor and shove debris off to be disposed of. Problems continued to arise, however, when the levels of radiation shorted out and fried these robots, forcing soldiers to take their places and gain the title of biorobots. No human had ever worked in zones of radiation as this, for the cooling rods as well as other parts of the reactor were laying all over the place on the roof. They each shoveled the material off the roof for 45 seconds before another team would replace them. They would experience aching hands, fatigue, and nosebleeds upon returning from the roof. 7 months after the accident, the zone was cleaned up and the sarcophagus put in place. While each liquidator celebrated in their own way, they were given very little as thanks for their heroic duties. Today, Pripyat is still a ghost town, nothing remaining but abandoned buildings overtaken by nature and memories of what was left behind. Former residents of the abandoned town, as well as liquidators and soldiers who worked to secure the reactor, began flooding into hospitals in the following months. Their conditions would be named the Chernobyl syndrome. There was nothing the hospitals could do for them. They were sent home damaged and tired. For this brave army, they're still at war, and slowly, they're losing. The sarcophagus was only built to last around 30 years, but 31 years later, the threat still hides underneath. 3,000 liquidators have been taking care of the sarcophagus, but age and weathering has prompted the construction of a new arc-like structure that would cover the whole thing, named the New Safe Contaminant, or NSC. Originally, the completion date of this structure was set at February 2010, delayed to 2013, 2015, and now November 2017. You can view a live feed of the construction, feeling a bit more safe that it's being built better late than never. The Chernobyl disaster was a massive topic to cover in such a short amount of time, but what I did was take information from 2 documentaries, one about what happened to cause the explosion and the other about the aftermath. Both can be found in the description of this video.